Welcome to Tip Tuesday. I'm going to talk about quilt labels. Recently there was a post asking everyone what they were doing for the weekend. I happened to be binding Jean Harrison's row 4 at the time, and one of the members made a comment that she was working on a quilt label and having problems turning the corners. And I responded to her that I have a tip for that. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to show you what I do with most of my quilts, not all of them, but I wanted to use Jean's example to start us off with. So this is the back of row 4, and I have used a vintage napkin. It is a vintage linen Battenberg lace. I printed out the wording that I wanted to use off my printer, of course. I used a light box. Now, with this one being thin enough, I could have done it up against a window or even in some really good sunlight. I'm got this area well lit, so it may have shown through, but I normally use a light box, and you can easily make yourself a do-it-yourself light box. I get a very short container with a lid and get some LED pucks that have batteries in them, and you just press them and they light up. And I have 4 or 5 of those inside the box, and that's my do-it-yourself light box. That's what I use. But whether you have an actual light box or you use a window, it's really easy to come up with your printed words and your design and make a custom label. So what I did with this one is I actually cut it. I'm going to show you. I'm going to move things around because I do have some things I want to show you. I actually cut it. This is right here is a matching napkin. That was the size. These were brand new. I found these in a thrift store. I got them for $1 a piece. Some had been used, but most of the pack had never been touched. The one I used for Jeans had never been touched. But it's real easy. I'll give you some tips on laundering vintage linens in just a moment. But I ironed it down really well, starched it really good, got everything nice and flat. And so that is just the matching, one of the matching sets in the set. This is the actual piece that I cut right here. This is the leftover. And so if I turned it around, the Battenberg lace portion would be on this side. And so, as you can see, I have 2 halves here, or actually quarters, that I could actually make labels on. And I'll show you how that works in just a moment. Let's go back to Jean's quilt. So, I cut my piece, and I have 2 sides that are lace and edged. This right in here, this was laid on in the seam and sewed in the seam. What I used to hold this down was clear Elmer's washable glue. I just put a couple of dots down the edge where I knew that it would be within the seam and wouldn't be seen, and this would wash out. This is already washed out because I have soaked and cleaned this quilt. But it's a great way. I just put a few dots, going down about every inch. Take my iron, heat set that to dry it, and it gives you a good stick. And then I can work on pulling the label over, pinning it, and then when I'm ready, I can go ahead and hand stitch this on. So that's how I kept that in place. There's another product you can use to keep things in place other than regular type of fusible material. The issue I have with this is it is see-through a little bit, and we have this lace, and I don't want to take away from any of that, but on the edges, again, when you're getting ready to sew it down, you could also use this Heat and Bond soft stretch, and there's the width. You could even cut that in half, and that'll help you keep things in place nice and tidy as well until you get it stitched down, and then you can hand stitch it. In the hand stitching portion, I'm going to raise this up. You can hardly see any of that hand stitching. I use the same thread that I used for the back of the quilt, which is bottom line, same color. And I did my tiny stitches all the way down because the bottom line is such a lightweight thin thread, it just melts right back into the fabric and you won't even see it. So I chose this one because this quilt, this table runner, is an heirloom piece. It is a keepsake since it is Jean's last quilt. And this is not something that's going to be used for every occasion, and it will be hand washed or soaked if it needs to be. But that's why I chose this delicate piece, because the quilt itself, you remember, is very delicate itself, and I wanted the label to complement the quilt. Let's talk about other type of vintage linens that you could use for your labels that would not require you to have to turn corners. Again, I showed you this is the leftover piece, so I could very easily make a cut here, have these two raw edges set in the seam of a quilt, and all I would have is this wonderful lace on the edge that would need to be laced down, and I have a label. My marking tool of choice that would be permanent for a label are these micron pins. I personally like the 0.25 millimeter. I do put the iron on it to heat set it. You shouldn't have to because it's permanent. It's got a very, very fine tip. And the reason why I use this particular marking tool is, especially when you're working on linen, and this is linen right here, it does have a tendency for a marker to bleed. And I used a corner to test right here to show you. If you mark really lightly, real gentle, see, I can put dots on there. It doesn't bleed like it would with another type of marker. And again, this is such a fine, tiny point. It's great for adding the embellishments of like the butterfly on that last label, or swirls or anything like that. You can go over it and make it a little bit darker. So this is my marking pen of choice. Again, it's the Micron 01 0.25 millimeter, and they come in different colors, so you don't have to necessarily use black. I have purple, so it just depends on your project. This is another Battenberg lace. This is very common. These are little napkins. There were 3 or 4 in this set. There's not a lot of lace edging other than the corner, and this is cotton, this is not linen. So again, you could just use a quarter of this napkin, and you would actually have, you know, several pieces out of it that would accommodate a label. Here's another favorite of mine. This is a vintage doily with tatted edges that I found for 10 cents. The napkins you usually can get for $1 a piece. This vintage piece here, it does have some darkening, and some of these may have stains. I have a product for you that you can use that will 99.9% of the time take care of these issues and bring these doilies back to life. That product that I use is a Retro Clean. It was developed by individuals for quilting and vintage products, and I've been using it now for 2 years, and this stuff is amazing. Another product that I like to use is OxyClean. It can work also, but if you happen to use a label that has silk type embroidery on it, it will remove the sheen, so be careful with the OxyClean doing that. Retro Clean is fine, but OxyClean, you need to be careful of those type of threads losing their sheen. So these make beautiful labels on heirloom quilts. And sometimes they need to have a little repair work done, but that's okay. So that's another option for you. Here is a cute little option. I found this, it's just a little dresser doily, and that would be really, really cute on the back of a really bright quilt. And you could use it either way. Again, now this one, unless you wanted to cut it, you could cut the edges. I wouldn't cut it. I would just use a little bit of this Heat and Bond soft stretch to permanently make some tacks so that it won't lift, and then I would just hand stitch that down. It would make a cute little label. Here's another pack of cotton napkins that I found this past weekend at another thrift store. Again, $1 a piece. There were 12 of them. I can get at least 12 labels out of these. Another item that you may consider are handkerchiefs. And I wouldn't necessarily use a really good handkerchief, but you may find a handkerchief that has some pretty work on it that maybe was stained or had holes in it, that it wouldn't be really worth anything much, but you could cut the area out that you would wanted. This would make a beautiful label right here. I would not cut this one. Now with these are a little thinner, so I definitely would back them with some another fabric. I would do with a Kona white behind this. And you also have to be careful of the cut work. If you don't want your quilt showing through, then you definitely want to back with a solid colored behind them. But this is another beautiful option to make a special label for. Here's another one, a simple. This still has the original tag on it. I found it at a thrift store. Paid $1 for it. Again, I wouldn't necessarily use this one unless it spoke to me and said I needed to use it on a quilt. But if it had a hole or something in it because it's old, this would be another option. And that lace would just really set off your work. Another thing to consider with these type of works, and also you can get into the actual placemat setting that are larger and more rectangular, is these make excellent, wonderful. Let me do this real quick. If you can imagine hanging sleeves on a quilt. You can do several side-by-sides for the length of your quilt. So if you have an heirloom quilt, these make beautiful sleeves. I did one recently for a vintage handkerchief that I quilted and framed. it originally was going to be a hanging, a wall hanging, and I used a handkerchief on the back to make the hanging sleeve, and then the recipient decided that she would prefer it to be mounted in a frame, so we did that instead. But this is your Tuesday tip. I hope it helps some of you with some ideas. I'm thinking you could probably go out to any retailer or order online just plain cotton or linen napkins if you want to say linens, modern ones if you want, and use those as well. You don't have to use vintage. So these are just, again, some options for you to think about when creating your labels. I wish you happy quilting, everyone. Bye-bye.